The first and most comforting message of the sermon is that God sees every tear, every sorrow, and every struggle that his people experience. The title, If You Are Crying, Listen to This Message Until the End, speaks directly to individuals who may be feeling overwhelmed by emotional pain, disappointment, loneliness, or despair. The sermon begins by assuring listeners that no matter how difficult their situation may seem, they are not invisible to God. He knows their circumstances completely, and cares deeply about what they are going through. Even when people feel forgotten by others, or believe that no one understands their suffering, God remains present with them. The sermon acknowledges that crying is a natural human response to pain. Everyone experiences seasons of grief, fear, loss, disappointment, or uncertainty. These emotions do not make a person weak or faithless. Instead, they reflect the reality of living in a world where challenges and hardships exist. The speaker encourages listeners not to feel ashamed of their tears, but to recognize that God understands human emotions. Throughout the Bible, many faithful individuals expressed sadness, fear, and grief while continuing to trust in God. Their examples remind believers that faith and emotional pain can exist together. A central lesson of this keynote is that God's silence should not be mistaken for his absence. During difficult times, people often wonder why their prayers seem unanswered, or why their circumstances do not improve immediately. The sermon teaches that although God may not always respond in the way or at the time people expect, he is never indifferent to their suffering. His work often continues behind the scenes, even when it cannot be seen. Believers are encouraged to trust that God remains active in their lives, guiding them according to his wisdom and love. Another important theme is God's compassion. The sermon portrays God as a loving Father who is close to those who are hurting. Rather than rejecting people because of their weakness or emotional struggles, he welcomes them with mercy and understanding. This message encourages listeners to bring their fears, disappointments, and questions honestly before God. Instead of hiding their emotions, they are invited to pray openly, trusting that God listens with compassion and responds with perfect wisdom. The sermon also teaches that pain can have purpose, even when that purpose is not immediately understood. While God does not necessarily cause every hardship, He can use difficult experiences to strengthen faith, develop character, and deepen dependence on Him. Seasons of suffering often teach patience, humility, compassion for others, and a greater appreciation for God's presence. Although believers may not understand the reason for every trial, they are encouraged to trust that God can bring good from even the most painful situations. Hope is another major emphasis of this keynote. The sermon reminds listeners that their present suffering does not define their entire future. Emotional pain may feel overwhelming today, but it is not the final chapter of their lives. God is able to provide comfort, guidance, healing, and renewed strength according to His perfect timing. This hope helps believers continue moving forward instead of becoming trapped in despair. The message also encourages believers to remain connected to God through prayer, reading scripture, and the support of a faith community. These practices help strengthen spiritual resilience during difficult seasons, sharing burdens with trusted family members, friends, or church leaders can also provide encouragement and practical support. Faith does not require facing pain alone. God often works through caring relationships to bring comfort and healing. It is important to understand this message with balance. The sermon assures believers of God's loving presence, but it should not be interpreted to mean that emotional suffering will disappear immediately, or that every painful situation has a simple explanation. Grief and healing often take time. Christians may continue to experience sadness, loss, or uncertainty while still trusting in God's faithfulness. Seeking support from trusted loved ones, pastors, or mental health professionals when needed is fully compatible with a life of faith. In conclusion, The first keynote teaches that God sees every tear and never abandons those who trust in Him. Even during seasons of sorrow, His compassion, wisdom, and presence remain constant. Believers are encouraged to bring their pain honestly before God, hold on to hope, and trust that He is working for their good, even when they cannot yet understand His plan. This assurance provides comfort, strengthens faith, and reminds listeners that they are deeply loved and never alone in their struggles. The second keynote of the sermon centers on the message that seasons of suffering are temporary and should not be seen as the final destination of a believer's life. The speaker acknowledges that when people are experiencing pain, grief, disappointment, or hardship, it can feel as though those difficult circumstances will never end. However, the sermon encourages listeners to hold on to hope, trusting that God is able to bring healing, restoration, and new opportunities according to His perfect timing. Although the path may be long and challenging, suffering is presented as a season rather than a permanent condition. The sermon begins by recognizing that everyone encounters difficult periods in life. These may include the loss of a loved one, financial struggles, health problems, broken relationships, emotional exhaustion, or uncertainty about the future. During such times, people often feel discouraged and may question whether their situation will ever improve. The speaker reminds listeners that these feelings are understandable, but encourages them not to allow temporary circumstances to determine their entire outlook on life. Faith invites believers to look beyond present difficulties and trust in God's continuing work. A central message of this keynote is that hope is stronger than despair. The sermon teaches that even when no visible progress can be seen, God is still working behind the scenes. Delays should not be interpreted as abandonment. Instead, believers are encouraged to remember that God's timing often differs from human expectations. He may use periods of waiting to prepare people spiritually, strengthen their character, or arrange circumstances that will later reveal His purpose. This perspective helps believers remain patient rather than losing hope during seasons of uncertainty. Another important lesson is that suffering can produce spiritual growth. Although pain is never easy, it can teach valuable qualities such as perseverance, such as humility, compassion, and deeper dependence on God. The sermon explains that many biblical figures experienced long periods of hardship before witnessing God's deliverance. Há diversidade de dons. Their stories demonstrate that difficult seasons can become opportunities for personal transformation rather than allowing suffering to destroy faith. Believers are encouraged to let it strengthen their trust in God's faithfulness. The sermon also emphasizes the importance of remaining faithful while waiting. Sora, hope is not passive optimism, but an active decision to continue praying, worshiping, serving others, and obeying God despite difficult circumstances. Waiting with faith means refusing to allow discouragement to control one's heart. Instead of focusing only on what has been lost, believers are encouraged to recognize the ways God continues to provide strength, wisdom, and daily blessings, even in the midst of hardship. Another significant point is that restoration may come in different forms. People often expect God to solve every problem exactly as they desire, but His answers may look different from their expectations. Healing may be emotional rather than physical. Relationships may be restored gradually rather than instantly, and new opportunities may replace those that have closed. The sermon encourages believers to trust God's wisdom, believing that His plans ultimately serve their good, even when they do not fully understand them. The message also reminds listeners that they are not meant to endure suffering alone. God often provides comfort through supportive family members, friends, church communities, and wise counselors. Accepting encouragement from others is not a sign of weak faith, but a recognition that God frequently works through caring relationships. In times of deep emotional pain, seeking appropriate spiritual, emotional, or professional support can be an important part of the healing process. It is important to understand the sermon's promise with balance. The statement that suffering will not last forever expresses hope rather than guaranteeing that every problem will end quickly or in a specific way. Some challenges may continue for longer than expected, and complete healing may take time. The Christian message is not that believers are exempt from hardship, but that they do not face it alone. God's presence, strength, and guidance remain constant even when circumstances are slow to change. In conclusion, the second keynote teaches is that painful seasons are temporary and should never erase hope. Believers are encouraged to trust God's timing, remain faithful during trials, and believe that He is able to bring restoration according to His perfect wisdom. By focusing on God's faithfulness rather than temporary difficulties, they can face suffering with perseverance, courage, and confidence that brighter days can still lie ahead.